Think it is that Kevin Rudd is lacking confidence and trust from the Australian people?
Well, the story is almost bizarre, isn't it? I think it's quite sad that the Labor government made the decision to go with Kevin so late in the period. I think if they come undone in these elections, it would have been much better that they'd come undone with Julia Gillard leading them than Kevin Rudd. In my view, Kevin Rudd is a leader that has been really discredited by his own conduct. His colleagues sacked him because they judged him to be incapable as Prime Minister. He, it's alleged, was active against the government during the elections. May be true, may not be.
In 2010, you mean?
Yes, the perception was. I think that had a terrible effect upon Labor and probably put them into the position that they needed to enter into coalition with the Greens, which was a very limiting factor in their last 3 years, and they were destabilised in that last 3 years. Again, it would be seen by a lot of Kevin's activities. So here's a man that really has done the Labor Party enormous damage, destabilised it, and is now wishing to present himself to the Australian people as an alternative, as a Prime Minister and as the incoming Prime Minister. I don't think the Australian people will cop that, to be quite honest, and I think that's very sad for the Labor Party.
What about Tony Abbott? Do you think what sort of Prime Minister do you think he would make?
Well, of course, Tony Abbott hasn't been Prime Minister yet, and one has got to make judgments on the type of person he's been up to this point of time, and he will have the opportunity, if the polls are right, to prove what he can be as Prime Minister, and he's going to have apparently going to have the opportunity, and I think he'll probably be a pretty good Prime Minister because he's a very sincere, nice type of human being, and I think he'll be very dedicated, focused in the job, and we certainly need, in the economic times we're about to go into, some really clear and good leadership.
4 days, less than 4 days out from the election, Tony Abbott and the Coalition are still yet to reveal the costings that will pay for and the method with which they'll pay for their big spending promises, things like the paid parental leave scheme, the $3.2 billion on direct action on climate change and infrastructure projects, the 1.5% cut to the corporate tax rate. Does that trouble you that we still don't know how those things will be paid for?
Well, providing they do it in the next day or two, and there is adequate time, a few days, for the electorate to be able to understand that and for a debate to occur, I think that's quite reasonable. You don't want to announce all your policies at the beginning. You want to do it progressively to maintain interest in the process of electioneering, and so you can't really announce all your costings until you deliver the last policy, so that's not unreasonable. But I would hope that they do it, not later than Wednesday, Thursday at the latest, to allow that to be correctly reviewed and discussed and challenged and so on.
What will you be looking for from that?
Well, I think credibility will be very important. I think the Australian people will certainly look for credibility. There has been, I think that it was a great mistake to claim that the public service has endorsed something that they hadn't done and then force the public service into saying, we haven't done that. I think that did credibility a great damage.
On the Labor side? On
the Labor side, and I think people will look and expect the figures to be credible.
Given the level of confidence being so low and concerns about the economy, is now the right time to be introducing a $5.5 billion a year paid parental leave scheme?
Well, or a disability scheme. They're both very big ticket items.
But are they comparable?
Well, they're both desirable depending on your point of view.
Do you think one more so than the other?
Well, I wouldn't make a judgment on that. If I was disabled, I'd obviously think the disablement scheme. If I was a young lady about to have a family, I would probably think that was important. But both are important. I think the parental scheme is a good one. Because you don't expect Emma to go on holidays at half your rate of pay, and you don't expect to take your long service leave at half your rate of pay. It's also good because one of the most important things in Australia for us to prosper going forward is our intellectual property, and to deny half the workforce to be able to participate in that intellectual contribution in the workplace is a big limitation to the economy. And of course, a lot of people who are being paid higher are the people that have greater skills, greater training, and they're just the people that you want to have their child and come back into the workforce as quickly as possible.
We've learned today that Tony Abbott is quite prepared to dissolve both Houses of Parliament and take us all to yet another election as early as next year if he is scuttled in the Senate from achieving his ambition, which is to abolish the carbon tax. If he wins this election on Saturday, does he have a mandate, do you think, to push through his legislation to appeal the carbon tax?
Well, if he wins the election, and if the polls indicate by a significant margin, he clearly has a mandate. And the political tradition has always been that if you go to the polls with a very clear policy and you're endorsed by the electorate, well, then you have a mandate. I think the Labor Party or whoever would be very unwise not to recognise that mandate, because if you want to get defeated twice, that's a good way to do it.
You mentioned earlier that you thought it was an extraordinary intervention, I guess, when the Treasury, the Finance Department and the Parliamentary Budget Office came out and clarified their positions, were made to clarify their positions after some comments from Labor. Do you think the public service has become politicised? By
implicating them in something that was not correct, they were clearly politicised. I think Martin Parkinson and his colleagues did exactly what they should do professionally, and very much in doing so enhanced the standing of the senior members of the public service in the view of the Australian people. I think it was in some ways quite a courageous thing to do, but it was exactly the right thing to do.
Let's put your other hat on, and that is as chairman of Fairfax. The Murdoch press has run some fairly provocative headlines during this election campaign. In fact, on the very first day, the front page yelled out, "Kick this mob out," in reference to the government. We saw just this last weekend, "We want Tony." They're clearly barracking for a coalition victory on